With Trigger being the newest stun agent released, there's a few things that everyone wants to know. How do I play her? How do I build her? And of course, most importantly, is she only good with Ambi? Well, thankfully, today I'll be answering all these questions and more. But first, before we go further, I'd like to remind you all that the footage from today's video will be from the creator beta server, so things are subject to change. However, with this out of the way, let's now break down everything you need to know to play Trigger. Trigger's core gameplay revolves around her unique resource, which allows her to do three things: remain off-field, apply daze and damage to enemies, and provide the team her stun damage buff. Her gameplay loop involves filling her resource bar to full using charged basic attacks, performing a quick assist at the end of said move, using defensive assists when possible to generate more daze, and then ultimately activating Trigger's attacks with another character while she's off-field. Similar to Ambi, these off-field attacks are considered aftershock damage as well, so sets and buffs that affect this are helpful. Now beyond this, her core passive increases a target's stun damage multiplier by 35% for 5 seconds, even when the enemy isn't stunned, and this of course makes Trigger even more valuable from a buffing standpoint. Now let's break down Trigger's core passive and additional ability. When Trigger's aftershock hits an enemy, the target's stun damage multiplier increases by 35%, and this will take effect even if the target isn't stunned. This is a significant damage increase across the board, and is one of the main reasons Trigger is so powerful as a stunner. Trigger's additional ability activates when paired with an attack agent or an electric attribute character, and when active, if Trigger's crit rate surpasses 40%, each percent above this threshold increases the daze dealt by aftershocks by 1.5% up to a maximum of 75%. Long story short, 90% crit rate is what you'll be aiming for on Trigger, since this is when she receives the maximum daze bonus of this skill. Moving along, let's talk about her basic attack. Trigger's normal basic attack is standard, but this isn't typically used despite its nice animations, since her charged basic attack is much more impactful. So instead, let's now break down Trigger's charged attacks. When Trigger holds down the basic attack input, she first enters the sniper stance and begins firing ahead. Next, any attacks in the state that hit enemies will generate Purge, which will be important when we talk about one of her later mechanics. When Trigger performs a charged counter or continues firing against an enemy in the sniper stance, she generates 25 Purge per hit up to a maximum of 100. But in addition to the Purge she generates while in the state, Trigger will also automatically evade while in the stance and can even adjust her position while on the ground by simply tapping to move around. Side note, evading or dodging an attack when an enemy strikes will also cause Trigger to automatically perform a charged counter. The final feature of her sniper stance includes the ability to perform a finishing move when releasing the basic attack button, and this is followed by a quick assist of the previous character. Now the reason Purge and Trigger's sniper stance are very important is because they set up and allow her to activate Harmonizing Shot or Harmonizing Shot Tartarus while off field. To begin using Harmonizing Shot, an ally must first use a basic attack, dodge counter, special attack, dash attack, or quick assist after Trigger has Purge, and when used, this will consume 3 Purge per shot. To activate Harmonizing Shot Tartarus, an ally must first use an EX special attack, an assist follow-up, or an ultimate to then use a more powerful version of the previously mentioned shot. Now, in addition to having a completely separate condition to activate this version, it is also more powerful while consuming 5 Purge instead of 3 per shot. Side note worth noting here is also the fact that this can only be used up to 2 times within 20 seconds for the entire team. Next, let's talk about her special attack. When performing Trigger's EX special attack, Trigger deals decent damage in daze, but more importantly, she also triggers a quick assist and enters the coordinated support state. This state is very impactful for Trigger as it allows her to activate Harmonizing Shot up to 4 times and last 6 seconds, but in addition to this ability can also be extended through repeat triggers and can even increase the total number of shots to 10. But on that note, let's talk about the rest of Trigger's skills, starting with her assists. In general, Trigger's assist related abilities are nothing special. The amount of days that her defensive assist and the assist follow-up has are actually very worth using. Unlike in other cases where skipping over assists in favor of dodge counters is better, Trigger actually gains incredible value by performing these assists and its follow-up by performing these, so keep this in mind when approaching bosses or encounters. Trigger's dodge skills are almost never worth using since she normally stays in the sniper stance or is off-field after building Purge, but in case you were curious, these abilities are also pretty standard and unnoteworthy. Trigger's chain attack has a decent damage multiplier on it, but as with most stun agents' chain attacks, it doesn't do much beyond this. And now finally, Trigger's ultimate is fantastic for 2 reasons. First, the amount of days it deals is extremely high, and second, this actually provides Trigger with 6 free harmonizing shots and lasts 12 seconds, unlike any of her other abilities. These two features make her ultimate very important to manage during fights, as this is definitely one of the easiest ways to stun and buff your team at the same time. Skill priority wise, Trigger's core passive and basic are the most important because of the value they provide both in terms of stun damage and days, but following this, her EX special, ultimate, and assist are all roughly similar in upgrade value. Trigger's dodge is the last skill in terms of value for upgrading, but as a reminder, this skill isn't nearly used as much as the others, so do with this what you will. Regarding Trigger's combos, she honestly doesn't have many, and as a result, you can instead follow this thinking when approaching combat. Once Trigger performs enough charge attacks to generate maximum purge, she is typically swapped off field and only swapped back for the occasional defensive assist, EX special attack, or ultimate. Because of this, I also have one combo that will universally work for her, with adjustments that can be made depending on the fight. To start, open the fight with Trigger, immediately hold down the basic attack input and perform 4 basic attacks in the sniper stance, then release said basic attack and activate her quick assist. Following this, swap to another character, perform a defensive assist on them, then return back to Trigger with said assist so she can use her EX special attacks or her ultimate to daze the enemy. Now, as a side note, you should keep in mind that each EX special attack or ultimate will activate coordinated support, but in addition to this, it'll also cause her to use harmonizing shot Tartarus if the cooldown is available. Overall, Trigger's generic but effective combo is very simple, as she just aims to generate purge and swap off to another agent. This is so that she can daze plus activate her core passive stun damage multiplier for the team, but that isn't to say that certain fights can't be optimized or that specific teams don't have tips or tricks to make them perform better. This just means that Trigger's baseline combo is very straightforward and honestly pretty easy to perform. For W engine choice, Trigger has several options, but let's start with her A rank choices first. Steam Oven, Box Cutter, and Precious Fossilized Core are all fantastic options, but Core was tested to deal the highest amount of days across these A rank engines. Now again, that isn't to say that Steam Oven or Box Cutter perform poorly, however, as these do have very usable passives and stat increases. For S rank options, her signature is easily her best choice as it provides defense shred and increased impact, but other options like Ice Shade Teapot, Blazing Laurel, and even the Restrained work here too. Among these engines, it is also worth noting that the Restrained is technically the free-to-play choice among said options, but personally I wouldn't spend your 30 or so pulls on the currency in the shop. Before we move to my recommendations, it is also worth knowing that the performance of each of these engines does change depending on the fight or encounter, so use this to better decide the right choice for you when it comes to her engine. With this, the recommendation that I now have for W engines is to use Precious Fossilized Core as your A rank option, and then any of the S ranks I mentioned earlier if you have them. That said, Trigger's signature W engine is very good should you be on the fence about pulling it. The defense shred, the added impact, and the crit rate from its main stat can help a ton when building Trigger, but before you wonder if this means that her signature is a must-have and Trigger is bad without it, this is absolutely not the case. Her alternatives are definitely fine for the purpose of buffing and dazing on a team, and so if you have her W engine, she'll definitely perform amazingly, but don't let this cloud your judgment as she will still do fine without it. In regards to Trigger's builds, she has a few options depending on what your goals are. Shadow Harmony is great as a general 4-piece set that enhances Trigger's damage and crit rate, but other sets perform well too. Because Trigger's aftershock attacks are considered basics, 4-piece Shockstar also works amazingly if dazing is your main priority. If neither of these are available, Astral Voice and Protopunk are both equally usable too, as they each increase the overall damage of a team by a noticeable amount. Trigger's best 2-piece set is Shockstar Disco if she isn't using it as her 4-piece set effect, but otherwise using something like Woodpecker for additional crit rate, or using any sets that have more crit rate rolls on them than others will work too. Speaking of crit rate though, let's now move on to stats. First and foremost, Trigger values crit rate and impact most of all, as these two stats are directly tied to how well she dazes and stun enemies. As a result, crit rate is one of the most important main stat and substats that she can look for. Substat wise, however, focusing on crit rate followed by crit damage and attack like any other typical DPS will be Trigger's go-to. Regarding her main stats, Trigger's 4th slot is best reserved for crit rate, as reaching the increased daze threshold of 90% is very important, but following this, her best 5th slot is either electric damage or pen ratio depending on the team composition. Finally though, Trigger's best 6th slot being impact should be no surprise, as dazing is her #1 priority. With this, I now have a sample stat line alongside some recommendations for Trigger's disk drive set and her main stats. You're looking for 90% crit rate, roughly 100 or more crit damage, and anywhere between 162 and 186 impact depending on your build. With the stat line, the main stats that you're looking for are 4th slot crit rate, 5th slot electric damage, and 6th slot impact. As a final reminder, these are just recommendations, and the ideal or optimal main stat can definitely change depending on a number of factors. Let's now move on to Trigger's Mindscapes. Her first Mindscape, like other agents, is very helpful and great value should you decide to pull for it, and this is because of the reduced cooldown of Harmonizing Shot alongside the increased stun damage multiplier that adds great damage to an already amazing core passive. In case you were curious though, this doesn't actually end up beating the value of getting her signature if you were debating on pulling this or a second copy. That said, there are other factors at play between the signature versus Mindscape debate, so don't use this as the only reason to pick one or the other. Her second Mindscape is actually pretty mediocre, as 24% crit damage is okay for a stunner, but falls short if you're comparing Trigger to other supports or buffers. At this point, I would normally pass over her third and fifth Mindscapes, as they are usually just stat increases, but actually for the purposes of Trigger and stun agents in general, having additional levels in her skills means that she dazes quicker and therefore provides even better value to the team. Now, despite these Mindscapes being more team focused, her fourth and sixth affect her personal DPS more. Her fourth Mindscape adds a new ability, Disconnect, that deals additional damage based on Trigger's attack. Despite this, the Mindscape does still add slight value to her team utility, as it does also inflict additional daze equal to her impact. Unlike her fourth Mindscape, however, Trigger's sixth Mindscape is entirely damage focused, adding a significant increase to her damage. Unfortunately though, this isn't enough to quite justify using her as a main DPS. In regards to Trigger's teams, I made a whole dedicated video testing every single team composition that you could think of, but I've read your comments and concerns from this video and wanted to give further insight into my testing before I summarize my findings here. First, experimenting conducted in that video did span multiple endgame modes, as Deadly Assault and Shiyu were some of the first places that I tested teams. However, as many of you know, the buff and enemies in certain fights will drastically affect the performance of teams, and because of this, fighting a more neutral, unaffected enemy in most cases would be fairer for the purposes of testing. Unfortunately, there aren't nearly as many enemies that are truly neutral for this purpose. That aside, let's now talk about the takeaways from my Trigger testing. First and foremost, Trigger's best partner is Astra, no questions asked. The two can be used with every DPS in the game, and truthfully, until they release a new limited support, it's unlikely that Astra will ever be worse than another agent. However, I did also hear your feedback about wanting to see comparisons of Trigger and a support compared to non-Trigger teams, so here were my findings. For her best teams, Trigger Astra was very competitive to the likes of Nicole Astra and even Caesar Astra. That said, Trigger did fall short against Yanagi Astra for Miyabi specifically, but these clears were still close regardless. Moving beyond just Miyabi Trigger based teams, it is also worth noting that Ambi Trigger had close clear times compared to Miyabi herself. Because of this, I had a few conclusions and findings for this as well. Ambi, though amazing DPS wise alongside Trigger, was definitely less of a character that could be used in all situations. What I mean by this is that Miyabi had a way easier time simply fighting neutral enemies or brute forcing through resistant targets, where Ambi definitely struggled to do the same. Regardless, however, Ambi did have impressive performances, especially when used against electric weak enemies. Now finally, for those of you that were curious about the performance of teams that didn't include Astra, Lucy, Nicole, Lighter, and Caesar were the highest performers when paired with Trigger afterward. Among the tested teams, lineups like Soldier Zero Ambi, Trigger Nicole performed great, and even a composition like Evelyn Trigger Lighter showed amazing results too, despite being a double stunner setup. Overall, the easy to learn nature and strength of Trigger as a character was constantly present throughout these teams, as I rarely had to make huge changes to receive similar or satisfactory results in these squads. Personally, I did find that using Trigger for any reason led to a much smoother experience when it came to dazing enemies, so if you're in need of a stunner for any encounter, she can definitely fill this role well. The final question I aim to answer with today's video is whether Trigger is actually worth pulling for. Like with all characters, this question has a lot of context and factors you need to consider though, so I offer you the following to potentially help you with this decision. To start, Trigger is one of the easiest stun characters that Zenless has ever released, and truthfully, she feels much more satisfying to play than someone like Lighter, who was previously the closest thing that we had to an off-field stunner. Additionally, she offers a lot to any team, as the added damage that Trigger provides through her stun damage increase and the added daze/damage from her harmonizing shots are not easily ignored. In general, Trigger's role as a fairly generic stunner makes her very usable in most team compositions, assuming you aren't using her with anomaly agents only. Despite this, however, I do want to say that I did find some decent results with Trigger alongside anomaly agents. Overall though, this is something that I really wouldn't recommend. Moving past this, I do acknowledge that Trigger does also feel specifically catered to buff Ambi, as the aftershock synergy between the two is very obvious, but personally the only flaw flaw that I felt from playing Trigger is having to sometimes lock in and pay closer attention to when I use certain harmonizing shots. Feel aside though, I also understand that pulling for yet another support/utility agent may feel bad, but honestly this is the closest thing to an Asha level buffer currently available. With all this, I do believe that Trigger is more than just an ambi buffer and can definitely take teams to higher levels, even if they aren't electric or aftershock focused. Regardless if she has her signature or if you're playing her with the top tier DPS teams, Trigger has proven herself to be valuable in a variety of different ways. Because of this, I believe it's worth it to pull for Trigger, especially given her already amazing stun potential. For me personally as well, I'll also be pulling for Trigger, but as always guys, spend responsibly and remember that even skipping a unit that may be worth pulling for is honestly okay. After all, it's just a gacha game. Don't feed into your FOMO. Thanks for watching though guys, I appreciate it. As always, I hope you enjoyed or learned something from today's video. If you want to see more content like this, feel free to check out the rest of my socials, my Discord, my YouTube, TikTok, Twitter, etc. Feel free to like, comment, turn on the notification bell, and subscribe as well, and I'll see you all in the next one. Stay safe, stay healthy, good night.